this straight.
Yes.
Pagano.
Pagano. That's
There
right.
we go, we got it. With a name like Pagano, I mean, I keep thinking there's no way you couldn't come to something like Druidry at some point in time. So, Drum, as he likes to be known, has been in Druidry for probably more years than most people have a career. It's been over 3 decades, heading on 4 decades. And as such, he's a leading figure in the community, not only within the Andriac Faith, but also as well, he's a member of other organizations. And you'll be talking about that a bit this morning, some of the other organizations. So we're really happy that so many of you could make it. We had many, many people saying, the flu got me. So as many as could come, this is wonderful. And basically, we look forward to hearing of your wisdom and your years of experience, and hopefully the live stream will work and everything's good, Lisa, on your end? Looks like it. Awesome. So once again, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
And we look forward to hearing.
Great, thanks.
Okay, thanks.
My name is Jean Pagano. Pagano is actually my last name. It's not like a derived, kind of cool to have pagan name. It really is my family name. And also known as Drum. There's the story behind that, which is probably a different story for a different day. But I'll tell you anyway. I was going through an initiation a number of years ago, and my mentor said, go to sleep tonight, and you have to think of a name that's going to be important for you, and it'll come to you in a dream. And I thought, okay. So that night I dreamt about a friend of mine who's a drummer, and so I dreamt about my friend playing drums on his drum kit. And that was all I could remember. So he's like, the next morning my mentor says, wow, what's the name? And I said, Drum. I'm not really a drummer myself, but I mean, that was the message that I got in the dream. So thank you, Phil, for playing the drums in my dream many years ago. I'm currently a member of Archdruid, I'm the Archdruid. I've been with Archdruid since near the beginning. Archdruid started in 1983. I became a member in 1984, although I've been talking about it before then with the founder, Isaac Bonowitz. I read a book, and I was talking to Farrell about it yesterday. I read a book called Drawing Down the Moon, which was a really important book in the late 70s, early 80s, because one of the things about paganism in general is that people, started to have these feelings or notice these things in the age of Aquarius or whatever was happening in the 1960s, and they didn't know how to characterize these things, and there really wasn't the sense of community that we have today. So when Drawing Down the Moon came out, it was really, it was during a period of time that we like to call the festival movement, where people would get together, pagans would get together at festivals. And it was, festivals accomplished a number of things, but the primary thing that it accomplished was a sense of community, a sense of getting together with people and saying, this person would say, I believe this, and you would say, well, I believe that too. And so all of a sudden there's this instant, just to add water, sense of community that arises. So Drawing Down the Moon really talked about a lot of different pagan traditions. Margaret Adler was brilliant. It was a foundational book. And as I read through it, I was fascinated by all these things because, I would say, well, yeah, I did that, and yeah, I did that. And I came to a part in there about this organization called the New Reformed Druids of North America. And it talked about Druidry, and it was kind of Druidry light, but I really didn't have much exposure to Druidry. And so I, decided that I would look at the contact information and contact the person listed. It was a man named Isaac Bonowitz. So I wrote to Isaac and I said, Isaac, tell me about New Reformed Druids in North America. And he said, sure, I'll give you this information, no problem. He goes, but I'm also starting this brand new group. And for $35, you can get in on the bottom floor, on the ground level of this thing. I think memberships at the time in ADF were $20 or $25, but it must have been like a shipping and handling charge added to it. So I became the 8th member to join ADF, March 10th, 1984. Before then, my parents were French, and their experience, I was born in the States, they were in the States at the time, and their experience their religious experience was really more Roman Catholicism, French style, which is, some people practice, some people don't practice. My mother is still fairly devout. I asked my father about it one day. I said, "Do you really believe this stuff?" And he said, "Well, I'm just hedging my bets." So he passed away earlier this year. I'm not getting any insights from him on to whether those bets were worth hedging or not. But I really always had kind of a problem with the Christianity never resonated with me. It's not that I didn't like it; it just didn't resonate with me. My parents, when they first took me to the First Catholic Church, walking in the door, the first image I saw was this poor man nailed to a cross, and it was, as a little kid, it was kind of disturbing, quite frankly. And so, but just to date myself a little bit, it was still the Latin Mass at the time, and so there was a certain air of mystery about it. Here's this man with his back turned to you, saying these words in kind of a lyrical fashion, and so the component of ritual I found very interesting. But I really didn't resonate with the ideas that, just with some of the stories that I heard, they just seemed a little bit foreign to me. I don't know why. But when I was in grade 8, there was, we had a section, and the book we read was Edith Hamilton's Mythology. And it was a book about Greek gods. And I found it fascinating because of the stories. Yes, please.
Sorry, I've had a request to try and move the microphone closer because they said it's a bit muffled. So we'll move you, we'll move the camera.
I'll speak up. So we read this book, Edith Hamilton's Mythology, and I've become enamored with the Greek gods. They just really made sense to me. The stories seemed real, the gods seemed real. So I read the book, and it came time for the exam. There was a question on the exam. The question said, the Greek gods are still worshipped today. And I said, true. And so I got the paper back, and of course that answer was marked wrong. The teacher was like, no, they're Christians in Greece. They don't worship the gods anymore. And I'm like, I was crestfallen. I thought, oh no, how could they not be worshiping the gods any longer? So at that point, I decided to do as much research as you could. At the time, research wasn't internet-based. It was go to the library and look up books. So I decided to do a magical working, Raising the Winds, by calling the god Aeolus, who was the god of the winds in Greek. And it was my first magical working ever. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing, but at the end of what I was doing, the winds lifted. So I was an immediate convert. I thought, wow, this really works. So between 1972 and this time, I've done a lot of magical workings that have had less results than that. But that one was a good one to start me out. And that's really where I began. When I found out about Druidry, the Reformed Druids of North America, there is quite a bit of information out about them. And we'll talk about them more in a little bit. But I decided that I thought being a Druid was kind of a cool thing. And there wasn't a lot of information, so I had to kind of make do or make up what I thought was appropriate. I always liked trees. I always liked nature. And so I felt that there was this affinity for the trees. And part of my practice was to recognize or to observe as the seasons would change. I would go outside and I would just listen. I wanted to be able to kind of feel the seasons change. And I don't know if that ever happened, but that was my first early observances of things of that nature. So, enough about me. Let's talk about Druidry. The history of Druidry, when I did this talk last week, and it was the first time ever that I had a whiteboard. And so I always wanted to get the whiteboard out and say, you had the whiteboard turned backwards and then say, on this board is all of the collected first source information on Druidry that we have. And so I turned it around, of course it was blank, because we really don't have any direct source information about Druidry. much of the information that we have comes to us from historians. People like Pliny, people like Caesar, who encountered Druids in their journeys. Druidry became very interesting to the Romans because the Romans were consumers of wine that came from Gaul, that came from modern-day France. And there was early trade established along the Mediterranean between Rome and between the south of France because they wanted to get wine, which they bought lots of it. At some point, they discovered that if they went in and took the wine, they didn't have to pay for it. And so this was part of the reason that Caesar found his way into Gaul, was to not only bring Roman civilization to the west, but also to get his hands on some wine. So Druidry, we really don't know at what point Druidry is established. We identify Druidry with Celts, and we'll talk more about Celts and non-Celts when we start talking about ADF a little bit later. But the Celtic migrations from the east of Europe through Europe, the Druids migrate west and get to where they're going to be about 500 before the Common Era, so about 2,600 years ago, 2,600 years ago. When they get to the British Isles, we believe that things like Stonehenge and other standing stones were already there. These megalithic monuments were really monuments that were created by other peoples, and that the Druids just happened to be around at the time. Did they use them? We believe so. Do we know that for a fact? No, we don't know that for a fact. But Druidry, as we believe, was established in Gaul and also established in the British Isles, along with Ireland. So we have this group of people that are described to us by people like Caesar, who gives us some information about them. Things such as they wear white robes, and they cut down mistletoe, and they're judges, and they preside over things, and they're exempt from military service, and that, according to some reports, that they preside over human sacrifices, and that they preside over other matters. So these are the things that were reported to us. We like to believe the part about being judges and being learned and being people who spoke to other people. They were mediators in battles and mediators in such situations. We don't know about the sacrifice part. I mean, it was a long time ago. Things were a little bit different then. But the thing with Caesar is Caesar was fighting wars in Rome. Wars are expensive. And so from time to time, after certain battles or after certain incursions, Caesar would have to go back to Rome and ask for more money. So when you go back to Rome and say, hey, I need more money, people want a reason. So if you go back and say, these barbarians sacrifice humans, then it's like, there's shock in the Roman Senate and money freely flows. One of the great ironies of that, of course, is that in Gaul there was a ruler called Vercingetorix, and he was a member of one of the tribes. And Celtic or Gaulish tribes were never known for their confederation. They were tribal peoples, and they pretty much stuck to themselves. Vercingetorix was able to rally people to his cause to try to stay the Roman invasion. And at some point he was somewhat successful, but in the end the Romans prevailed. They then took Vercingetorix in chains back to Rome, put him on display, and they eventually killed him. So I guess that wasn't human sacrifice, that was just killing a human, but that's part of the irony of that story. The Romans make incursions into Britain, and they encounter perhaps druids, if you want to call them that, at the same time there. There is a famous battle that happens on Anglesey, the Isle of Mona, where a Roman general destroys the druidic presence there. what had happened was with the Romans were more than happy to let you have whatever belief you wanted, as long as you had a patrilinear system of succession, and as long as you paid your taxes, you're fine. You can believe whatever you want to believe, and this was all fine and good. The stories that we are told, especially about Anglicy, is that there was kind of a hotbed of dissension there, and that these druids were causing some problems. So the Romans wanted to put down any kind of dissension. At the same time, roughly the same time, there was a ruler, or a woman in the British Isles named Boudica. And Boudica was the wife of a ruler, or of a ruler, we'll call him that. And the Romans had occupied the area. And so her husband paid his taxes and did everything as he should. And all was good. So, unfortunately, Boudica's husband dies. And so Boudica says to the Romans, well, all is well. I'll take the reins, and we'll pay your taxes, and all will be fine. And the Romans said, taxes are good. You, as a ruler, are not good. So there were a number of incidents between Boudica and the Romans and her children that kind of incensed her and caused her to do what Vercingetorix did, kind of rally the local troops. And so about the same time that the Druids are being destroyed on Anglesey, now there's some famous stories about the Druids on Anglesey or Mona are casting curses at the Roman soldiers. The Roman soldiers are fearful and they don't want to advance on it. But the Romans traveled with soldiers and with seasoned soldiers. So when the regular soldiers didn't want to deal with it, the seasoned soldiers came up in front, and they were less concerned with curses and things of that nature. So Mona falls, Anglesey falls, and Boudica at the same time is heading west to encounter the Romans because she has a bone to pick with them because they have done horrible things to her family. She ends up meeting the Roman soldiers. She's collected a number of tribes and quite an army with her. However, she encounters them from what I've been told, in a blind canyon area. And when the Celts would travel, they would travel with their families. And so military people in front, families in the back. So the families are blocking the entrance to this canyon. The Romans are overhead. Things do not end well for the Celts and for Boudica. So that uprising is squashed. The uprising in Anglesey is squashed. The Romans will come back about 8 or 10 years later and deal with Anglesey again. And that, for the most part, is the end of Druidry as perhaps classical Druidry. So when the Romans leave, eventually, something else comes from Rome that's going to affect Druidry, especially further west, and that is the church. Patrick comes to Ireland. I think Patrick's influence is perhaps overstated, but the presence of Patrick and what happened because of Patrick is not overstated. The church comes to Ireland, and things change. The church establishes itself, and Druidry is eventually replaced. So then what happens? Well, how do we know anything at all about Druidry at this point? Well, luckily for us, as the Dark Ages arrive, the presence in Ireland of monks, for some reason, they decide to start writing down the oral traditions that were found in Ireland. So much of the histories that we have, especially stories of the gods, come to us from these Christian monks. The stories that they handed down to us are stories that are peppered or flavored with Christian references. So you'll have a mythological story, and then at the very end they will say, praise to the Trinity, praise to Mary, praise to whatever. And I think that was basically to tell a story, but they have something there where the ruling people could say, oh, this is okay because it's couched. And I'm going to guess, I'm not a historian, but I'm going to guess that there were some changes that were also made along the way to remove perhaps gods that were popular or changed the stories. We see some gods that die and then they come back. Mia, one of the healers, is killed by his father, and then we see later stories he's back again. So I'm not really sure how that happens, but maybe somebody wrote something down wrong. With the coming of Christianity, functions that were normally performed by druids were most likely consumed by the same people doing the same things, only under a different context, under the context of the church and Christianity. Some of the things that were written down were early Irish laws, laws that were called Brehon laws. These laws remained in effect for quite some time in Ireland until until the 17th century, when the old Irish orders were replaced by an English order, and those Irish laws were then gone. So, Druidry during this period of time, from the coming of Patrick forward, kind of disappears. If someone tells you there's an unbroken tradition from that time until now, I think they might be mistaken. I'm not going to say that they're mistaken, but I think they're mistaken. So what happens is, in the 18th century, people start to look around. I mean, it's the Enlightenment era, or post-Enlightenment, and people start looking around and seeing these monuments. They see the Stonehenges, they see the standing stones, and they say, these must have been built by the Druids. And so there's an interest, a new interest in looking at some of these ancient things and ascribing value to them. And so some of the values that are ascribed to them are Druidry. There's nothing really known about Druidry, but people are all of a sudden interested. And over a period of time, and this is probably, I'm going to say that this was probably men, maybe they had long white beards and at the time who put together these ideas, but there was this kind of idea that Druidry had caused these things and they were somehow affiliated with it. So it began what was called a Druid revival, in thinking about Druidry. And that kind of piqued some people's interests. And so some stories were made up in the next 100 years or so about what Druidry was. If you go to sacred text, sacredtext.com, there's some old books out there, some which are rather fanciful in their stories. Some of them were speculating, and they're interesting stories. Some of the stuff is interesting, some of it is probably just downright wrong. But there were Druidic orders that were created at the time, and these became, some of them they surely were not religious orders, but they were more like fraternal orders or mystery orders. There are some that say Freemasonry was involved with the Druidic revival. There are others, there were organizations in the States, the Ancient Order of Druids, which became a fraternal organization, much like our Elks or things of that nature. There are monuments in Chicago that were built by the Druids. These were a fraternal order, and not the Druids that we think of today. There were some famous people who were involved with Druidry. There's a photo I saw recently, and I don't know how accurate it is, but it's a photo of the Queen before she's coronated as a young woman, and she's walking with this woman who's described as a druidess. So what kind of a druidess she was, it may have been one of those orders, but I just thought it was interesting that there was that connection. There was an organization called the Ancient and Archaeological Order of the Druids that was later joined by Winston Churchill. So when people say Winston Churchill was a Druid, well, he was part of the Ancient and Archaeological Order of Druids. So the revival fueled a lot of writing and a lot of interest. So at the beginning of the last century, some people began to think that Druidry might have a religious component, but I don't think that was necessarily well defined. But I think there was the thoughts that perhaps there was something more to this than just, what were they doing in these monuments? I think the thought that perhaps there was some religious function to this was not unusual or unthought of. The ancient Druid order was a group that was that had connections to the Theosophical Society, Order of the Golden Dawn, and they were part of this revival that extended into the 20th century. And a lot of what they were doing, especially if you look at what was going on in the occult or theosophy at the time, really is part of what's called the Western magical or Western mystery tradition. Much of what we see today in paganism as far as ritual comes out of that movement. Pollock, quarters, casting a circle, whatever the case may be, this comes from there. In the 40s and the 50s, the ancient Druid order attracted the interest of a couple of individuals who were friends. These individuals were Gerald Gardner and Ross Nichols. Gerald Gardner goes on to be a foundational and formative figure in witchcraft revival. Once the witchcraft laws of 1951 are repealed in England, it's okay to be a witch again. And so Gerald Gardner puts out a book that describes his experiences and his tradition of witchcraft. Nichols, on the other hand, takes a slightly different turn. And Nichols' work, Nichols comes out with a book called the Book of Druidry, which may be in the public domain now, but it's actually an interesting book. And he describes his view of these things, and for him, it's Druidry. So they kind of go their separate ways. Everybody knows what happens after Gardner. Gardner has a number of people that he influences very heavily. Ray Buckland is one of them. Ray Buckland is foundational and important in the foundation of Wicca, witchcraft in general, in North America, in Western Europe, and then he brings it over to North America as well, and things start from there. Ross Nichols gets involved becomes involved with a group called the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, which is a revival group. And, there's nothing wrong with the revival. The revival is, we wouldn't be here talking about Druidry in the North American fashion without the revival. Ross Nichols comes into Obad and really starts the ball rolling with modern Druidry, I think, in that sense. Ross, I believe, is the chosen chief of Obad. After Ross Nichols, a new Druid takes his place, Philip Carr-Gum. And Philip Carr-Gum is still currently the head of Obad. The Orders of Bards, Ovates, and Druids have they're a worldwide organization. They count thousands of members, people who've taken their courses. They have 3 levels: Bards, Ovates, and Druids. The Bards are really those people who work with bardic studies, with poetry and oratory and things that are bardic in nature, solemn. The bardic program that's offered by Obad, and all the programs are really remarkable. I'm a Druid grade in Obad. I went through their training. I think it's really cool. It's they would not consider themselves a religion, and I would, for anybody who's interested in it, the cost is not insignificant, but it's a great program. It's into material. It's very structured. You do energy work. You do ritual work. And it's non-denominational. You don't have to be a pagan to be an Obad Druid. Excuse me. Obad is all over the world, and after you finish your bardic year, you move into your Ovate year, or your Ovate training, I should say. It may take more than a year. And the Ovates are people who were seers or healers. And so the studies in that part of it deal with those things. And then the next step is the Druid grade, which is more about more Druidic matters, more matters of decision-making, ritual performance, doing different ceremonies for weddings or funerals or things of that nature, plus a lot more. They use a lot of information that they gather from the myths, and it's really, really beautifully done. Highly recommended. And their rites are also very nice. They're what I consider standard Western magical tradition. Cast a circle, do a bunch of stuff, and I don't mean to minimize it in any way by saying that, but I don't want to give away the story either. I think the rituals are good. If you have a chance to visit them or practice them, please do so. There have been initiatives in the States and probably elsewhere for ADF druids and OPOD druids to get together and do things together. Excuse me. I'm talking to me. So, that's OBOT. In 1963 in the United States, there's a small college called Carleton College. Excuse me. Sorry about that. There's a small college in Minnesota called Carleton College. They're a small liberal arts school, and they had a religious requirement. Many of the liberal arts schools in the States were related to Protestant denominations, and they had church requirements. So what they did in 1963 at Carleton College is they said, you don't have to go to church on site, you can go other places. And so, I mean, people can go into town. Oh my goodness. My apologies.
My heart can't help.
Sure, that'd be great. I'll try anything at this point. So the religious requirement is such that they can go into town to go to church or something else. So there's a group of individuals at Carleton College that says, why don't we start our own religion? Why don't we become druids? And so they formed, at that point, the Reformed Druids of North America. What's interesting about the Reformed Druids of North America is that they wrote everything down. So there's thousands of pages of information from 1963 to the current time. If you're interested, the website is rdna.info. There's tons of stuff out there. Like OBOD, RDNA was not denominational. The early RDNA people were Episcopalians, they were Jewish, they were all kinds of things, not necessarily pagans. So they established a liturgy, which we will go through here in just a few minutes. And it was, it had a couple of features in it that were kind of unusual. One of them was the notion of the Earth Mother. RDNA liturgy is really focused on the Earth Mother and an entity called Baal, B-E-A-L, and also some other entities, one called Dalanat Landu, Dalan's son of Landu, the Lord of the Forest. Well, there is no Dalanat Landu, they made it up. Baal has some historical corollaries that may or may not be related to Druidry. And the Earth Mother is just that, the Earth Mother. I was fortunate in 2013 to go to the 50th anniversary celebration of the founding of RDNA in Minnesota. And when I was there, some of the founders were there, and we did ritual off of the original mimeograph sheets, for those who know what that is. So it was kind of cool. You were doing ritual off these old, weathered, kind of purplish print documents. And so afterwards, we got to talking about the foundation of Druidry. The Earth Mother in 1963 was added because they felt that there was a need, and we'll talk about this later, to help support the earth. That was an early environmental thought in 1963. And so the Earth Mother was a way to add a divinity perspective into the ritual, but also care for the earth. So I don't think those sentiments have changed since then. But what they did, they put together some rituals, which still exist to this day, and are still used. And they set up a couple of different, there's 10 orders, druids of different kinds of orders. The first 3 are the most popular. The last 4 through 9 are kind of hard to find because some of those people have disappeared or passed on or don't elevate people very often. The 10th order you get upon moving on to the next life, so we don't know much about that one. The first order, which you'll see later today, is basically just acknowledging that nature is good and nature is very good. And honestly, in a very fundamental way. That's what Druidry is about. It really is about maybe a nature-based practice or a nature-aware practice is a good way to describe it. I think there are other components as well. But in our DNA, there's the first order, which some of you may do. The second order requires a little bit more study. And then there's a ritual that goes on with that. And then the third order, after which you become a priest in our DNA, requires an all-night vigil. And in that all-night vigil, it's basically you and the fire, and you stay up all night. And typically the person who's sponsoring you will visit you throughout the night, give you things to think about, make sure you're still awake. And then the next morning, because this is a very serious religious tradition, they come, you do a ritual, and then you take them out to breakfast. Kidding about the serious part. But, so it's kind of informal. But it was, for me, doing my all-night vigil was really an important thing. In the early days of ADF, the vigil was still a part of what we did. And there's some parts, I mean, the veneration of the Earth Mother is something that was carried over into ADF. So what happens is at some point, there's a person called Isaac Bonowitz. Isaac says, step back for a second. There was a council set up called the Council of Dalanop Landu. You get to be a third order druid, you would join this. It was kind of like the ruling order, the people that made the decisions. And I don't think they ever made very many important decisions. The early days of our DNA, very early days, women were not allowed to be priests. That changed the next year or so through the council because they said that's silly. And the council never did very much, but Isaac Bonowitz comes along and says, our DNA should be neo-pagan only. It shouldn't have all these other people in it. And so that started a big discussion called the Isaac Fair that kind of polarized the community because there were those who thought that your religious belief should be your own. There were others that thought that it should be neo-pagan. So Isaac tried to convene the Council of Dalanop Landu to do this, and what happened was that the council went into abeyance, and that's been 1971, it's never been back since. And so Isaac said, okay, I'll take my toys and go someplace else, and he created the new Reformed Druids of North America, which was just like the Reformed Druids of North America, but they were neo-pagan. So that's where I run into Isaac years later, is in that component. Excuse me. So all of a sudden we have Druidry in North America. There are a number of different offshoots of Reformed Druidry. There was the schismatic Druids of North America, which were Gaulish. There was the Hasidic Druids of North America, which were Jewish or Druish. And there were other offshoots that had these different flavors of Druidry to basically fill a niche. Probably never had a lot of people in them, but some of the documentation is still out there.
So I had a question about to expand on the idea of Baal. There are some that would say that Baal is perhaps the sky father component or corollary to the earth mother. I don't know if that's really true. I came to some understandings during my vigil, and I think that the earth mother really represents everything that is tangible, everything that's material, everything that's you put your hands on, the earth, and I mean anything that's around us has some derivation from the earth. And I think that Baal really is the unseen. It's that which is intangible. So there's this dichotomy. And my experience, at least during my vigil, was I was in the country and had a rather large fire. And so it's me sitting or standing by this fire. And the light from the fire casts a certain circle of light. And then beyond that, it's just dark. You really can't. There may be lights way in the distance, and there are sounds that come in, but it's all this intangible stuff. So really, it's that I became acutely aware of the separation between that which I could see and that which I knew and that which I did not know. And so that's really to me what Baal is about. It's about that the unknown, and perhaps it's incorporeal or intangible, and maybe the sky and the things above us are part of that incorporeal and intangible thought. That's my take on Baal. There are others that may have written about it. If you look at rdna.info, there's the Archives of Reformed Druidry in America. It is a wealth of information, lots of pages of liturgy, of history, of thoughts. It was like the French Revolution comes to to modern religious thought. Things were a little bit different. But so ADF comes about, and ADF pulls a lot of the early days of ADF used what was called the standard liturgical format. And the standard liturgical format was a format that was used for ritual. It's since changed, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, to the core order of ritual. The core order of ritual is what ADF uses now, but the standard liturgical order in the past looked an awful lot like RDNA. There were components that were very similar for a good reason. It was kind of borrowed wholesale from there. The ideas that spawned ADF were that we're neo-pagans. So there's no unbroken line, neo-pagans. There's a description of three kinds of druidry. There's three kinds of pagans, paleo-pagans, meso-pagans, and neo-pagans. And the paleo-pagans were the people who really were pagans. That's because that's what they intrinsically were. Pre-church, pre-religious pagans. And then the meso-pagans are the people, part of the revival that come after that, who all of a sudden decide, wow, this must have been druidry. And then neo-pagans are the ones who are newly pagan, who become repaganized, perhaps, or discovered paganism for the first time. And they decided to do something with it. So some of the points of ADF, I'll cover just a few of them. I'm going into in great detail. But it's a neo-pagan organization, and the focus of ADF was on Indo-Europeans. And what does Indo-European mean? It means anything from Connacht in the west of Ireland all the way to the Indus River Valley in India, any place that Indo-European people traversed. So that would be Ireland, British Isles, Europe, into Anatolia, into where the Hittites in Turkey, the Aryans, the the Persians, the Avestan people of what was currently Persia, Iran, and into the Indus River Valley, Vedics in India. There was also and these were broken down into hearth cultures. So basically identifying and saying, well, these are the groups of gods that go with these people. One of the hearth cultures that's mentioned are the Tocharian people, which were Indo-Europeans who went to Xinjiang in China. They were the tall, mummified people that they find as 6 foot tall, red-haired people. But we really know nothing about them. The languages, the Tocharian language that was discovered in the last century is really more Buddhist, really, and so we don't really know anything about them other than they were Indo-Europeans. But so we've had this spread of Indo-European culture. And Indo-European really is about linguistic similarities. There's an Indo-European family of languages, and all of these people have these things in common. They also had fire in common. Fire in ritual was something that was common, and it's something that's still important to us today in ADF practices. One of the things about ADF, and I think perhaps it's a feature of modern paganism, and for some people it's perhaps a malaise of modern paganism, is that we don't have rigid rules. It's not like the Bible that has here's 10 commandments and here's these things you can and can't do. It's in some traditions it's do what you will. We have 9 virtues, and people are left kind of to their own designs as far as what they decide to do. We hope that people live a virtuous. But we don't tell you, in ADF we don't tell you what to do. We are not orthodox. We don't say this is what you must do or this is what you must believe. There's a few things that we don't do in ritual practice. No animal sacrifices, no blood sacrifices. We'll expand that to say no blood sacrifices. We don't call the quarters. We don't refer to Lord and Lady. So we have developed this format for worship and for practice that has become what is called the core order of ritual. Order of ritual is 18 steps. Some of them are optional, and if you do a high day rite and use the core order of ritual, we will say that you've done an ADF rite. So that's our proclamation, is that we will say that you've done an ADF ritual. One of the other, one bit of dogma that we do have is the concept of Archdruidic fallibility, which says that if the Archdruid says anything definitively, it's probably not right. So, and that's a good rule to have. So, we will do an ADF ritual later this afternoon, so you can get a look at that. But what happens with ADF is that we have, because there's no god or goddess, lord or lady kind of concept, we have, our gods have names. And so we also, our universe is broken down into some pieces. We have 3 realms that we talk about: land, sea, and sky. And so in the standard Western magic tradition, you would have air, fire, earth, and water. We have land, sea, and sky, and all of our rituals have to have a fire. So there's some similarities there, but I mean, fundamentally, we have the 3 realms. We have 3 hallows that we use in our practices. These hallows are the well, the tree, and the fire. And we have 3 kindreds that are related to these triplicities. And the kindreds are the ancestors, the nature spirits, and what we call the shining ones. So, and actually, if I can give an editorial comment here, I think that those 3 categories are really pretty brilliant, because in many religious traditions, the concept of veneration of ancestors is practical, is something that's easily done. The idea of spirits of nature, especially for nature-aware religions, makes perfect sense. We want to honor the spirits of nature and to protect them. part of, you know, being concerned for the Earth Mother. And the final part of that is the Shining Ones, which are the gods of our people, or your people, and all people. And that's the question of how broad that panoply of gods really is really a question of, you know, up for discussion. But I think it includes quite a few gods. You know, we often say gods known and unknown, names known and unknown. So there are probably many gods that we don't know about. But these are Indo-European gods that we do in our high day rites. For what people do at their home altars or shrines, that's up to them. You know, you can worship whatever you want, whether it's other gods or whether it's a basket of fruit. I mean, it could be anything that you want. It's really up to you. So that's a basic structure. ADF is an offering-based religion. We believe that we want to create relationships with our kindreds. So let's talk about the kindreds for a second. Ancestors. Ancestors are, my categories are, there's three kinds of ancestors. There's ancestors of the blood, which are our direct ancestors, our parents, our grandparents, you know, those who gave us DNA, those who caused us to be who we are today. And those are easy because for many of us, we know who those people are, and we can say, okay, I know, you know, this is my grandfather, this is my mother, this is whatever the case may be, and so we can recall them in that way. Then there's what I call ancestors of the heart, or ancestors of the hearth. And these are the ancestors that we feel a kinship to. So, for example, maybe heroes. Maybe I think Hercules or Heracles is somebody that I admire, and that's a tradition I follow. So those are ancestors that I call out to. Or Cahulan, if I'm in the Irish sense, or whoever the case may be. Vercingetorix, maybe if I'm in Gaulish. These are entities that I call out to. And then there's ancestors of the bone. And ancestors of the bone are those people who are buried beneath our feet where we are right now. Ancestors that we really don't know anything about them. Indigenous peoples that are long gone. What value do these entities bring to us? I have no idea how we're doing for time, so I'm going too long.
Right now we're at 10:14.
Okay. All right. When do you want me to finish?
Well, we have a room overall
Okay.
until noon,
All right.
but that means Kit and Caboodle were out of here by noon.
Okay.
So we've already had sort of a mini break, but if you like, we can take a mini break and finish talking about Druidry before we get into your
Okay.
second topic.
Okay. I'll wrap this up rather quickly than I really it was so long in
No worries.
the discussion. What do the ancestors bring to us? They bring us experience and they bring us guidance. When our ancestors must have had problems with relationships. They must have had problems with loss and hardship and love and things of this nature that we can relate to. They probably did not have problems with their iPhones or things of an electronic nature, but we can call out to them. I mean, I know, in looking back on my father, who passed away this year, I can remember the things that he said to me, and for me, I consider that guidance. And so I look to those things and I say, well, these are the things that I get from the ancestors, and it doesn't hurt to reach out to them and to say, you know, what guidance or what information can you give me today? Lisa has put together an ancestor presentation recently that is really beautiful and demonstrates or displays some ancestor altars. I would highly recommend that you take a look at it. I have an ancestor altar in my home, which just happens to be in her video. And it's a place where I have pictures of my ancestors or things or offerings to them. We'll talk about offerings in the devotional part of my discussion later. But the idea is to build relationships with them. It's good to say, you know, your ancestors are your ancestors, but sometimes we have to reintroduce ourselves to the things, the people and things in our lives that are important. if you just say, hey, give me guidance, they may or may not be open to that. But if I make an offering to you, if I give you something, an offering, for the sake of offering, the idea that we believe is that we build relationships between ourselves and these kindreds. So if I make an offering to you of something, then perhaps you will be open to a request that I have later on. Best to give and then maybe receive later, as opposed to saying, I need this right now. Give. I don't know that the divinities and the spirits around us give us those kind of relationships or those kind of that kind of feedback. So we build relationships. What do you give to an ancestor? Well, in our rituals, sometimes we give them silver into a well, for example, because the ancient Celts would put treasures into a well. Or we give them beer, or we give them alcohol spirits, something that is given. The beautiful thing, and we'll talk about this in my second presentation, the beautiful thing about spirits, about alcohol spirits, is that they evaporate. So the laws of the physical universe always maintain. So if I put water on my altar, or I put spirits on my altar, it will evaporate because that's the laws of the universe. But to a pagan, and when I see those spirits evaporating, I say, these spirits are being consumed. The entities are consuming my offerings. This is a good thing. So that's faith. Evaporation taking place because that's the laws of the universe, that's just physics. But I think that the two can meet. So those are the kind of offerings that we can make. Spirits of nature. What's so important about the spirits of nature? Well, we live here in what I call the middle realm with the spirits of nature. They are all around us, and we are kind of a part of them. We surely benefit from them because without the spirits of nature, literally, we could not survive. The spirits of plants and animals are what we consume to keep ourselves going. But there are other spirits in nature that we may or may not see. Spirits of place, spirits of rivers or forests or things that are intangible, or gnomes and sylphs and things of that nature that may be imaginary, but they still have potential. And we can still call to them as part of the spirits of nature. There are, you may have experienced going someplace and feeling something very special about the surroundings that you're in. And you may assign or ascribe a spiritual component to it. Like, wow, this is really a sacred place. And there's other places that are not so sacred, and those are easy to define but these other ones are not. The beauty of the spirits of nature is they talk to us about the cyclical nature of the universe, because there are cycles that we see. There are cycles that we experience in nature, in the world around us. These are annual cycles where they repeat. We have plants that start to bloom in the spring, they start to flourish, they bear fruit, they start to weather, and they start to die. And I'm going to start to cough. Sorry. And so we see those cycles in nature around us. And they teach us something about the cycles in our lives. I'll talk about this more in my second presentation. Goodness gracious. But they reinforce in us our relationship to the land, the sacredness of the world around us, and the cycles that we move through. Excuse me. We surely don't age on an annual basis, like the worm of nature does, and then come back fresh and new the next year. But we do age over time. There's this progression of changes that go through us that mimic the cycles of spring, summer, fall, and winter, but at an extended time period. The spirits of nature teach us these things and reinforce this with us. And for those who believe in it, when we finish this existence, perhaps we come back again, like the spirits of nature do. They're reborn and renewed. The Earth Mother is, everything comes from the Earth Mother. Everything comes out of the Earth Mother. And then we live on top of the Earth Mother. And then finally we return to her in one form or another. We are reconsumed and reprocessed. And whether we come back again is a question of faith or a question of belief. But, excuse me, that's what I think the spirits of nature bring to us, this appreciation of cycles that we cannot get around. The planet moves around the sun. All these things move in cycles. What about the shining ones? Well, the shining ones are the gods and goddesses of our people, whatever that means. Our people, meaning people in this room, people in my household, people in my community. It's this collective of entities, gods and goddesses, spirits, household spirits, lares, penates, whatever you want to call them. But they're spirits. So what's the difference about them? Well, as I mentioned before, we all live in the physical world. The laws of physics, the laws of 3 dimensions apply and maintain. You can't get around it. Can't move at the speed of light, we're stuck. That wall is solid, I can't walk through it. Anybody who tells you they can may not be telling you the truth. So we're constrained in 3 dimensions. And there are sometimes, and this is part of my discussion this afternoon, so I'll touch on it briefly. There are some times that we need a little bit more help. We need the laws of the universe bent a bit. Someone is sick, someone is dying, I need this, I need that. Sometimes we call them the shining ones for that kind of help, because I can't heal them directly. So maybe the shining ones can make these things happen, can bend the laws of the universe to heal someone or to bring me something that I need. Once again, in any of these situations, it's best to build relationships with them. What's a good gift for spirits of nature? Water is a great gift for anything in the spirits of nature, I believe. Water on the ground is always going to work. Water in the stream, chlorine, fluorine, we can talk about that later. But for the gods, once again, we think in ADF that using the fire as a transmuter, putting things into the fire and having them be consumed and transmuted into something other than what it originally was. By this, we release it as an offering to the gods. In our rites, we make offerings all the way along, and at one point, after we consecrate the hallows, we open the gates. The idea is that by opening the gates with the use of a gatekeeper, we change these hallows, the well, the tree, and the fire, into portals so that we can better speak to the ancestors, or we can span the worlds between the world of the shining ones and the world of the ancestors in this world through the use of the tree. And that by the use of the fire, we open it as a portal to the shining ones, this blazing fire that looks like a small flame, but is actually this huge flame that goes up to the heavens. By doing this, we feel that we're better able to speak to them. Do we need to open the gates? Do we need these hallows to talk to these entities? Not really, I don't think, but in a ritual context, yes, this is what we do. And then, the other thing that we do in ADF ritual is we do a final sacrifice. I'll get into that later if somebody wants to talk about it, but the world came into existence through sacrifice. The story of Ymir in the Norse tradition, of this giant being cut into pieces and his body being used to create the world. This is the gift of sacrifice that creates the cosmos. In the story of the Vedas of Purusha, first man, who cuts himself into pieces to create the world. This is also the idea of sacrifice bringing the world into being. So we commemorate that. Our final sacrifice in our ritual is used to do the same thing. Obviously, we're not going to do something as magnanimous as carving ourselves into pieces. But we try to give something that's a really big offering. But then, as we'll see in our DNA ritual, we like to take a moment. We like to say, has our gift, have our offerings been accepted? So we use sortilege usually, or other methodologies to query the universe or query the kindreds and say, are offerings or sacrifices accepted? Philosophical differences, I think the offerings are always accepted, but there's various shades of that. And after that, we do what's called, we partake of the waters of life. The waters of life are sharing of waters. In Wiccan traditions, cakes and ales. This is the ales part of it, maybe without alcohol. So, and then we unwind the ritual by doing the same things, by saying, thanking everybody for coming, closing the gates, and then being done. There's a lot more to it than that. I'm just trying to make it brief because I think I've talked too long already. But that brings us up to Druidry in the modern age. There are other Druid organizations out there. Some of them are offshoots of ADF, some of them are not. AODA, Ancient Order of Druids in America, has some study programs that are quite good. John Michael Greer was foundational in their practice for a long time. OBOD, very, very good organization. I highly recommend that you take a look at them. Form Druids of North America, they're free. You can become a Druid this morning. Hedge of Keltria, there's all kinds of them out there. Skip Ellison, our former Archdruid, on his website has lists of many Druidic organizations that are they're all over the place. There's Francophone ones in France, there's German ones, they're everywhere. We're everywhere. So I think that brings me to a close of my Druidry 101. I'll do a quick, if you want to take a break, we can, but we'll do a quick RDNA ritual. For those who are interested, for those who came late, you can become a Druid of the First Order if you so desire. There's no requirement. All you have to know is nature is good and nature is very good. That's all you get from it. You can say you're a Druid of the First Order. That probably won't get you much in the real world, but maybe some satisfaction.
What do you think nature is very, very
That's one of the great mysteries. I wasn't going to say that. So, thank you for your time. If you have any questions, see me afterwards or write to me.